In this game here, we're going up against Self-Wound Sun Ritual. His Sigvold has been damaged quite a bit. We're giving him bleeding. He's been putting damage on it from not every turn. And fun fact here, we'll actually show this here. This could risk him not letting us do this, but for those of you who don't know, Sigvold, he converts damage into bleeding, right? However, Unseen Elder's ability triggers bleeding. It does not do 1 damage. So actually, Unseen Elder will damage the Sigvold, even though Sigvold's ability is active, because it's activating bleeding. Now, he probably won't, we'll see if he notices, but really here what we want to do is we've got a massive amount of bleeding set up on this Sigvold, and he's going to probably keep damaging. If he uses his ability, it's not going to work out here, but the idea here is we did use the Armored Arrakis. We had the 7 bleeding on Nut. We could have used the Protofleder to convert that into points here. He's probably use Nut on this Vild Carl, and then potentially he will trigger the ability on Sigvold. If not, we'll show you a very big Protofleder here, which will be pretty awesome. If not, we've saved these leader charges because I want them at round 3. We're just pushing him here. I haven't decided to go all in yet. If we do decide to go all in and he triggers his Sigvold, I can put my 3 bleeding charges on a unit, and I play my Protofleder, he'll convert them into a full boost on himself, and I won't waste the leader charge value. In this case, though, we're going to be doing it on Sigvold because he did not click its ability. And Sigvold, by the way, would die at the end of our turn. So we will play this, and our Protofleder is going to be a 35-point Protofleder. That is really big, and actually Sigvold dies here too because he forgot that Unseen Elder triggers the bleeding and doesn't do damage. And that is a huge play here in a 35-point Protofleder. This is the type of stuff you can do with them. Won't see this very often, but if they only have 1 or 2 units to bleeding, this might be what you end up with. A big Protofleder as a finisher. Protofleder here is a 9-provision card, 4 power, deploy given enemy bleeding 3, then boost self by the amount of bleeding on that unit. Protofleder's had a couple changes. He went from 10 provisions to 9. He also used to drain by 3 if you had dominance. So if you had dominance, he would drain by 3 instead of doing damage 3. He used to do 3 damage, I believe, and then if you had dominance, he would drain, which was interesting. And it was essentially a 10 for 10, then it became 10 for 9, and then he got reworked into the form he's in now. The form he's in now is, I think, the most interesting form, and let's take a look at what this means. So, a base value, if you just play him on a unit with no bleeding, he's worth 9 provisions, he gives you 4, boosts himself by 3, and gives 3 bleeding. So, after 3 turns, he will be worth 10 for 9. That's not great. However, you can argue there's vampire synergy, and if we take a quick look here at the vampires, I like type in bleeding for a second, look how many cards have synergies with it. You can use Unseen Elder, speeds it up, that's okay. Catachan you can kind of count. Catachan's interesting. And we'll go to monster second here. And then you have the bleeding for Flater, you can count that as synergies. You can set up a Gale, I don't really count that much. And then you have the Garkins, which gain benefits from it. And it's a vampire, so it can reactivate Necrat a little faster. You get that, but he's really just not worth it if that's all you're using him for. So you really want some kind of combination with him to make his boost big. That's really what Protofleder is good for. Now, there's 2 ways, well, there's actually 3 ways that are really good for doing this. And we'll talk about them here for a second. So, one of the ways is that most vampire decks, for example here, play Blood Scent. Blood Scent as a leader ability. Order given enemy bleeding 3 for 3 turns, charge 3. Once all charges used up, spawn Ekamara. Now, over the course of this game, this gives you really good value, right? It gives you 9 bleeding, it spawns a 3 provision guy, that's pretty good. The bleeding gives you synergies. However, the weakness of Blood Scent, and historically this has been a bigger weakness against no unit decks and low unit decks. And nowadays if they have the Defender. If you can't put this bleeding on units, your leader ability is literally useless. So if everything that play has immunity, or if they're playing very low units at all, so that they wait till the end of the game to play units, and you're trying to conserve your leader charges round 1, you end up not being able to put Blood Scent on very many things. And the thing is, if you just stack all of Blood Scent's charges on 1 unit near the end of the game, then they're all basically worthless. You get like 2 points out of it. So this happens versus no unit decks. This happens, yeah, mostly no unit decks. This can also happen if you're trying to push for a round 1 or 2, like a 2-round. You're getting pushed round 2 and trying to hold on to your charges for value round 3. And then in round 3 they don't play units, they like play artifacts or something. Or remove your units. In that case, you might have useless blood scent charges with no targets. This is one of the big uses. If you have those charges that you can't use for anything else, you can, as long as they have one unit, Protofleder can convert those charges to points for you. And that's actually really handy. So in this case, we have the Protofleder. So we have 2 leader charges left over because they didn't play any units round 3. It's a short round 3. Our Regis got forced out. And we won round 2 because our Regis got forced out. And then they are playing very few units or something. Or even if it's just a short round 3 and they only have 1 unit or 2 units. They play that unit. You put both your blood scent charges on that unit. It suddenly has 6 bleeding, which will never gain value. Protofleder will convert that bleeding to value for you, because he'll put bleeding on it and then boost himself by the total bleeding on that unit. And in that case, instead of having your leader charges worth 1 or 2 points, they'll get their full value because Protofleder will convert them into a boost for him, which is really handy. This is a situation that you don't really want to be in, but if you have Protofleder, it's a good use for him. What I'd argue is more relevant and happens a lot more is in these vampire decks, you can run the Armored Arrakis. Armored Arrakis is really interesting because it is bleeding to the enemy's base power. So usually this will be at least 5. You can argue most units it'll be 4, but against most decks you'll be able to find at least a 5 to put this on. Now, that bleeding won't always go for its full duration, especially if you find a big unit. For example, say they're playing monsters and just right away they play defender, you put the bleeding on this at 7, something like that. You get the big 7 or even more in some cases. That bleeding will sometimes not always have time to tick all the way down. Especially if you're, let's say that your opponent, they get their old spear tip asleep. This is the extreme example. So they get their old spear tip asleep, or in this vampire mirror, they have Regis, and you force it out, which probably won't happen. But you have the big unit, it's 12, or say spear tip got boosted 18. You put bleeding on for its base duration, or for its base power, and all of a sudden when you play your Protofleder, it gets really big. That's a use. And this is not as unlikely as you might think, because a lot of times with Armored Arrakis, you want to set up your engines first. Like you want to set up your Flader, you want to set up your Nekarap, you want to set up your Defender, and all of a sudden there's less turns left in the round. Potentially you still want to play your Armored Arrakis because it gives a big bleeding duration to boost your Flader by, but you might not have time for that bleeding to all the way go off. And in that case, you have your Protofleder to convert that into points again. The other thing is, this is pretty similar to the neutral card in a lot of ways. The Undying Thirst. Vampire decks, especially ones that run Operator to make multiple Fladers, and then Incubus to bring them back, a lot of them play Undying Thirst. They play it for the 6 boost it gives your Fladers. However, a lot of times they have to set up all their engines, and you won't get the 6 bleeding off of this all the duration. But it does set up a very nice play for your Protofleder to boost off of. So you say you play that, and then the next turn, the bleeding's down to 5. Your Protofleder will put out the 3 bleeding, and then it will give himself a big boost, an 8-point boost, which makes him go to 12. Now, in this case, you won't really count the bleeding as giving him points. So in this case, it's still not amazing, but it does convert them to points, and it gives you the option of saving your blood scent charges. And then if you do save them and they end up being not useful, you can use the Protofleder on them. However, let's get to the last, and this is by far the most interesting case for Protofleder here. And let's talk about a pretty popular deck right now, which is Self-Wound Ursine Ritual. And this is hilarious. The reason Self-Wound Ursine Ritual is so good is because of Sigvald. It's all because of Sigvald. So whenever Sigvald is damaged by abilities, he gains bleeding for the same duration instead. Water damage unit by duration bleeding on the self purifies it. Fine, whatever. However, a lot of time they just stack a ton of bleeding on Sigvald, and this deck is pretty popular. So Sigvald's bleeding gets really high. If you Protofleder that Sigvald, you convert all that bleeding onto your Protofleder, and it gets really big. Really fun interaction. I want to point this one out as it's a popular deck, and it actually works pretty well against it. So Protofleder, if you're playing vampires and you run into Sigvald, he is a very, very powerful card, because they're going to try and have that bleeding on Sigvald as long as possible. So if you just let them build it up, and then you convert, say, like 10 or 15 bleeding to Protofleder boosts, that's a big deal. As far as Protofleder goes in general, I think he's pretty interesting. The main comparison is in the vampire decks, this is the 9 provision slot, so usually there's an argument to be made between Katakan, Protofleder, and Oriana, are the 3 9 provision cards you usually want to run. Cave Troll, you pretty much always run these types of decks, and then Naglfar as well, if you're playing Devotion. So it's between these 3. And Protofleder has a very interesting spot, in my opinion. He can deal with the saved up leader charges you didn't use. If you're playing the heavy Flader versions with the Feast for Blood, or Undying Thirst, and you're playing, in some cases, even Oriana's Order, by the way, or her deploy will sometimes be very high in bleeding, and the Armored Arrakis. Stuff like that gets a lot of bleeding. If you're doing that, Protofleder is actually a pretty good card to include. And it's really fun tech to have in case you run against a self-wound player. It's very funny. I often find myself cutting him from my decks in exchange for Oriana. However, with a lot of movement is popular and there's a lot of heat waves and such, this Oriana becomes worse. So potentially you can use the Protofleder if your vampire deck you feel has too many engines, which is certainly something that can happen. But yeah, I like Protofleder. I think he has a lot of uses, but you probably want him in a deck that can make use of him in multiple cases. So you want to have the Armored Arrakis in the deck with him. That is his best combo in my opinion. It's easiest to set up, most consistent. And you can also run Undying Thirst if you're playing a non-Devotion version. Non-Devotion version of Vampires I think is actually probably better than Devotion version for consistency. And you can also use the Oneiromancy to do a Witch's Sabbath type of deck with that. And the Undying Thirst is a good choice as well in that deck to run with the Fladers, and then your Protofleder will boost off of that. If you're having that type of deck, I actually think Protofleder is a really good card in it. Convert a lot of things to points. And in a Devotion deck, remember that if you have, say, like Bleeding 10 on something, and your Unseen Elder is out, it will actually go away much faster. So having that excessive bleeding put out by Protofleder isn't necessarily a bad thing. So say you put out a leader charge on something, and then you Protofleder it. It's 6 turns, but it's really only 3 as long as your Unseen Elder is alive. And you're going to try and keep him alive, so in that case, Protofleder isn't bad. He would actually get the full 3 bleeding value and the 6 boost. That wouldn't be bad. And he would be worth like 13. It's pretty good. But overall, I find him most useful in decks that are non-Devotion, that are running Arrakis Queen and the Feast for Blood, Undying Thirst rather. And I think he's really interesting, and I actually have a lot of fun with Protofleder.